Somebody once shared with me that counsel that comes out of all the contemplative traditions don't speak unless you can improve upon the silence. And it's always very hard to break counsel because there's no way to improve upon the silence. For me, the silence in this hall tonight is still filled with the good vibe of last night with Gary Walters and Carrie Newcomer. I just feel I can ride on that energy, and we can ride on that energy. Such a remarkable evening. And if I have time, Carrie told you 2 Quaker jokes, and I'm going to tell you the other one. But as we were having such a great time in here last night, I thought about a story I learned just last week. We were at an international folk festival over at Warren Wilson College, and I met this Irish storyteller who asked me if, when he learned I was a Quaker, I'm not quite sure how he knew. I didn't have the hat on or anything. He asked me if I knew about an Irish or Quaker utopian experiment in Northern Ireland dating back to the 19th century called Bestbrook, near Ulster apparently. And I said, no, tell me about it. And he got a twinkle in his eye and he said, well, this was a utopian community that Quakers founded, which would have no drinking and no cursing and no gambling, and therefore no need for police. George Bernard Shaw visited there, curious about how this experiment was working out around 1870, and a reporter later asked him, well, what did you think, Mr. Shaw, of a community in which there's no cursing and no drinking? And Shaw's response was, from the looks on the faces there, they could use some of both. I wish he could have been here last night. He also said, I tracked this down online, Shaw also said, I believe I saw a swan swimming on a pond there looking for a place to drown. But so last night trumped George Bernard Shaw. It was so much fun and not hard to do. Until the fall of 1974, I knew very little about Quakers. I was 35 years old and had served for 5 years as a community organizer in Washington, D.C. Burned out and in deep need of a sabbatical, my wife and I went to Pendle Hill as adult students with our 3 children. We planned to stay for a year and return to D.C., but the pull of Quaker faith and practice drew us onto the Pendle Hill staff and kept us there for another decade. I think I may have had the longest sabbatical on record. It's hard for me to imagine, it's really impossible for me to imagine what my life or work would be like without the gifts I've received from the Quaker tradition. In the 41 years since I arrived at Pendle Hill, Quaker faith and practice has transformed my life at every level, spiritual, personal, and professional. So I'm deeply grateful for this chance to speak to people who are among Quakerism's key trust holders, people who are helping to keep the light of the light alive. When my friends at FGC asked me to give this talk, I was glad to learn that the theme for this gathering was seeking wholeness in both our personal and communal lives. Wholeness is a vision that vexed and haunted me when I was young because I confused it with perfection. But it's impossible to live very long and maintain any illusions about that. So I had to find another way to define or understand wholeness. And here's what experience has taught me. Wholeness does not mean perfection. It means embracing brokenness as an integral part of life. wholeness does not mean perfection. It means embracing brokenness as an integral part of personal and communal life. So tonight I want to invite us to look at the Religious Society of Friends in that light, as a tradition that today is broken whole. Broken whole. I want to testify, if that's a word I can use in this context, to all that Quakerism has given me, and celebrate all that Quakerism has to offer a world in deep need. Just a little parenthesis. When I told some of my Jewish and Catholic and Protestant and Muslim friends what I was going to be doing tonight over the last few months, every one of them said some version of, please tell the Quakers how much we need them right now. Please tell them we need them. I also want, along with this testifying and celebrating, to grieve the fact that we seem to stumble over ourselves when we try to connect with the countless people who seek gifts of the Spirit that, in my experience, Quakers have in abundance. I'm talking about the multitudes who have spiritual longings but no spiritual home, who have walked away from or have never walked toward forms of Christianity that depend on hierarchy and external authority, that put intermediaries between the individual and the Spirit, that offer answers to questions no one is asking. That can be a big problem, you know. Traditions that are not socially or politically engaged in meaningful ways. At least 40% of Americans are unchurched, as they say, and the millennial generation especially contains many serious seekers who can't find a spiritual community that supports their seeking. I think we have much to offer these people. The bafflement to me is why we aren't connecting better than we are. Numbers don't tell the whole story about anything. I'm a recovering sociologist, so I stopped believing in numbers a long time ago. But the part of the story that they tell about us can't be ignored. As you know, over the past half century, Quaker membership has fallen off precipitously. Between 1972 and 2012, we lost almost 50, between 45 and 50% of our members, with no replacements in sight. Today there are 72,000 Quakers in this country, roughly half the number there were in 1972. And some very sober Quaker scholars have suggested that the Quaker community might end its run by the close of this century. Everything ends, I understand that. All things human come to an end. We grieve it, we move along. I don't want this tradition to come to an end. It's meant so much to me. I know that friends have been actively concerned about all this for decades. Some are trying to communicate Quakerism more effectively to the public. I'm glad, for example, to see our growing use of social media. And while I'm at it, check out my Facebook author page. I'm also glad, very glad, to see such deeper reaching and very promising renewal projects such as FGC's Quaker Quest, the Spiritual Deepening Project that is now being piloted, and Quaker Voluntary Service, which is attracting and cultivating a new generation of Quaker leaders. We need new forms of outreach to new populations, and slowly but surely we are creating them. The simple point I want to make tonight is that the underlying key to our renewal, I believe, is not in reinventing or repackaging or rebranding ourselves, words that ought to be refused. I believe that the key to our renewal is naming, claiming, and sharing with others the spiritual treasures we've always possessed in these earthen vessels that exist to show that the transcendent power belongs to God and not to us. So if we have to break the earthen vessels to continue to carry the treasure, let us do it with abandon and joy. But let us do it with care, because these vessels bear the treasure over time and keep it from being eroded by time. These treasures, I think, are sometimes hidden from us by our familiarity with them, and too often hidden from others by our reluctance or even inability to talk about them. We certainly must not let our declining numbers diminish our sense of the spiritual gifts we have to share with a world in great need. Tell those Quakers, said my friends, how much we need them right now. So tonight I want to speak very personally about renewal on the basis of my own experience of these spiritual gifts, in particular the lived experience of 11 years at Pendle Hill. I'm going to name 5 elements. There was a comedian who used to do, I'm going to name 5 elements of the Quaker tradition that have been transformative for me. I've chosen these 5 not only because I regard them as core Quaker assets, but because I have critical questions about how well we are preserving them and passing them along to other people. So, in what I hope is good Quaker fashion, after I've said a few things about each of the 5 elements, I'm going to pose a few queries for friends to ponder in private or in groups, however they may land with you. The first element won't surprise you. It was Pendle Hill's meeting for worship, which was held every morning, which in the long run was transformative for me. But before I could experience the transformative power of unprogrammed worship, I had to question it, resist it, and even doubt its validity. I'm taking myself back to 1974 when I sat down in my first meeting for worship, having been raised in the Methodist Church, having studied religion at college, having gone to Union Theological Seminary, and at no one of those stops having learned a lick about Quakerism. Just wasn't there. I don't think that my experience of questioning, resisting, and even doubting this form of worship is unique to me. I think it might be a little common among the folks who visit us and who wonder what this is all about. And I think we sometimes fail to help people with it. As I said, my religious background, I thought, was fairly deep and fairly wide. I did a doctorate in the sociology of religion at the University of California, Berkeley. I read Tillich, Barth, Niebuhr, Bonhoeffer, and their kin. So I was ill-prepared for the vocal ministry I began hearing when I attended the unprogrammed meeting at Pendle Hill. It wasn't that I disbelieved the core Quaker claim that every seeker has direct access to God. I just wondered about the source of some of the things I heard during my early experience of unprogrammed meeting. At one of the first meetings I attended, a bird was singing outside the open window. Suddenly, the friend next to me rose, whistled for a while in a rough imitation of birdsong, and then spoke for several minutes about the bird within. Making extended, and I emphasize extended, references to nesting, hatching, feeding, and other matters of ornithological interest. It was what's the Quakerly way to say this? I really want to do that. It was an idea that would not have occurred to me. It was certainly an idea I had never encountered during my theological studies. I was riffing through the table of contents with Bart when I got back to the house and wondering, just couldn't find it. I began to wonder what strange planet I had landed on and when I might catch the next spaceship back to Earth. Now, you will soon recognize that this is not a story about that friend. It's about me. Just hang with me for a while. I was a mouthy and headstrong 35-year-old. Thus begins the confessional portion of my remarks. So my vexation spilled over into conversations with some of Pendle Hill's elders. I told them that the Quaker version of the spiritual journey seemed uninformed and undisciplined to me, one lending itself to narcissism squared and sanctified. I believe that was the phrase I used. Like I said, mouthy and headstrong. The elders I talked with had the immense wisdom not to defend, but to inquire. And they had the patience to hear me out as they asked questions to help me explore my feelings and my experience. Over time, I came to understand that while my concerns had some merit, they were not, by a long shot, the whole story of either Quakerism or Parker Palmer's reaction to the world. I learned that the true problem lay neither in the Quaker form of worship or in that whistling friend. It was in me. In the unprogrammed meeting for worship, these elders helped me understand the received faith that I had depended on, received from books and preachers and teachers and externalities of all sorts, was coming apart around my ears. I was no longer getting propped up by professional externalities, and I was in spiritual freefall. But as friends helped me understand what was going on inside of me, my freefall was slowly arrested. And I began to use the meeting as a context in which to reconstruct my faith on the basis of personal experience. Slowly, I came up with my own answers to that classic Quaker question, "What canst thou say?" I still recite from time to time that lovely Sidney Carter couplet, "Your holy hearsay is not evidence. Give me the good news in the present tense." For example, as a survivor of clinical depression that had taken me close to death's doorstep, I was eventually able to see in the unprogrammed meeting as I listened to the heartfelt testimonies of other friends, including people who talked about the bird within. I eventually saw that I no longer needed to rely on anyone's theology of resurrection. I had a direct experience of it. A direct experience of it. I could go on with this story, but I'm going to end this piece with those queries that I mentioned. So this first element of my transformation at Pendle Hill leads me to a couple of queries for our consideration. And they have to do with our capacity to help people enter into the worship experience that is central to the Quaker tradition and to pay attention to what's happening for people in the worship space. Do you think we sometimes take it so for granted as the core of what we're doing that we don't really see the wrestling folks are doing in the midst of something we love? I love it so much I have to keep my eyes open for that all the time. So, some queries. Are we creating safe space in the community for people to be open and vulnerable about how the worship journey is going for them? These are risky things to say. And I was saying them to people like Douglas Steer and Bill Tabor and Mary Hoxie Jones, who was a total trip on these questions. I think she kind of liked them. Rufus Jones's daughter. And some other great teachers, John Youngblood, names that some of you will know. And they were receiving them with such depth that my vulnerability felt safe. So, do we have members who are on the alert and have the capacity to help people hold the struggles that come with this form of the spiritual life? Who are they, and how can we support them in becoming strong spiritual friends and companions? I wonder, too, as I think back on the daily meeting for worship at Pendle Hill, how we can expand opportunities for worship beyond the once-a-week first day meeting to give people chances to deepen that experience. I'm not sure that my life and my work would have taken the form it has. In fact, it probably wouldn't have if I hadn't had that deep immersion experience to draw on every day of the week. Can we, for example, form small worship circles that meet weekly at times other than first day? Or can we revive an old Quaker practice that I learned about from the late and extraordinary Bill Tabor, who taught me to say, let's take an opportunity. 2 or 3 friends sitting together for 15 or 20 or 30 minutes of silence, an impromptu moment to sit in the presence for a while and emerge refreshed. I don't think we have to reconvene everybody 7 days a week to deepen the experience and deepen the opportunity. These are human scale things that we can do. But as long as we take meeting for worship for granted as something that everybody, of course, should enjoy, it's not going to happen. And I just ask you to remember that for a while this friend didn't enjoy it one little bit, and I may speak for some others. The second transformative element of my Pendle Hill experience involved members of the community who had a deep understanding of the Quaker tradition, who had studied it, who had not necessarily been raised in it, but who, once they got the taste, wanted to know more and had pursued that knowledge in reading and in conversation. These were people who helped us hold standards that kept Quaker faith and practice from morphing into whatever we wanted it to be. And for all the strengths of this tradition that I so love and that has so transformed me, it is, in the wrong hands, all too easily morphable. And we need to watch out for that. The quickest example I can give relates to the nature and conduct of Clearness committees, which I regard as a critical component of the Quaker experience and which have time and again, rightly done, rescued me from what I can only call deep oatmeal. I keep pushing the edge, wondering how much I can get away with. You know, we're finding out as we go. At the heart of the Clearness Committee is a radical commitment to and dependence upon that of God in every person, the inner teacher, the inner light, this voice of truth. So the rules that govern a Clearness Committee, rules that I was taught by some people who were masters of the tradition, those rules forbid members from doing anything that vaguely resembles trying to fix, save, advise, or correct the focused person who brings a question or concern. You don't get anywhere near that kind of speech. It's like touching the third rail, and you blow the spirit right out of the room. You ask honest, open questions. And have you thought about seeing a therapist is not an honest, open question. It's a Quaker rally. The whole idea of the Clearness Committee is to create safe space for that person to have a deepening conversation with that of God within him or her. And when members of the committee try to replace that voice of truth and wisdom with their own, the space quickly becomes unsafe. Quickly becomes unsafe. And just parenthetically, I would argue that one of the great needs in our world these days is safe space for truth, soul truth telling. One of the deepest needs we have. And it's a gift we have to offer the world, but only if we're willing to practice the hard disciplines and craft of knowing how to create safe spaces. I too often hear about meetings where the practice of clearness committees has fallen away from this norm. Friends use the Clearness Committee basically to tell the focus person what they believe he or she ought to do with the problem at hand, which, let us be candid about it, belies a lack of confidence in the reality and power of the inner teacher. Perhaps this is why I also hear about meetings where clearness committees are not practiced or even known as a Quaker practice. As Gresham said, bad money drives out the good, and it can happen with practices of this sort as well as with fungible commodities. Of course, slippages like this are not intentional. There's no one of ill will doing this kind of thing. They occur because in the absence of teachers who understand and can teach Quaker norms, meetings easily backslide into the default standards of our culture. We live in a culture that encourages us to fix, advise, correct, and save each other because it does not believe in that of God in every person. We live in a culture that regards us, you and me, as empty vessels, which is why we do so much religion and education as we do, filling all those empty vessels with someone else's version of truth. Every form of religion is at constant risk of reverting to cultural business as usual, but Quakerism is at special risk for two reasons. First, at its best, it is profoundly countercultural, and it swims every moment of every day against a powerful non-stop current, such as the disbelief in the reality and power of the inner teacher. And second, its open form of worship and its belief in continuing revelation can easily be mistaken for anything goes. What has been revealed to you in the last 5 minutes, I'll talk about that in a moment or two. So I want to pose two queries for friends' consideration. Do we have people in our meetings who are well grounded in Quaker faith and practice, people we can and do call on to review our practices, to remind us of the plumb lines of our own tradition, and to help us stay true to our own norms? And if we lack such people, are we intentional about inviting well-grounded friends, teachers of the tradition, to visit our meeting for a while, not just come in and give a talk, but to be a resident friend for a week, to examine our practices with us and remind us about the norms of our own tradition? These are simple questions, but I think they're terribly important. What all those seekers out there are seeking is not a cheap version of what we have to offer. They're seeking the real thing. The thing that I began experiencing at Pendle Hill that so gripped my heart and mind that basically took over my life and my work and gave me my vocation, because I saw that it was endlessly rich and bottomless in its possibilities in the hands of the remarkable people from whom I learned. Not all of them on the staff, some of them passing through, some of them so immersed that the stuff was like breathing for them. The third transformative element of my decade plus at Pendle Hill was coming to understand what I think of as the paradox at the heart of the Quaker way. And that paradox can be stated thusly, I think. A commitment to community and to discernment in community is no less central to Quaker faith and practice than is an affirmation of every individual's direct access to God's guidance. Let me say that again. A commitment to community and to discernment in community is no less central to Quaker faith and practice than is an affirmation of every individual's direct access to God's guidance. At best, we hold the paradox of radical reliance on the inner teacher and radical vulnerability to fearlessly sifting and winnowing in the gathered community whatever we believe to be true. That's a paradox. Niels Bohr, the great Nobel Prize-winning physicist, once said, "The opposite of an ordinary fact is a lie, but the opposite of one profound truth may be another profound truth." That's a paradox, right? I love that Niels Bohr story because it clarified something for me. There's another Niels Bohr story that raises questions. He had some visitors. I'm going off the reservation now, so I'll try to come back. But he had visitors in his lab, this famous Nobel Prize-winning physicist, and above his experiment table where he had done so much work, his visitors saw a horseshoe. And they said, "Niels, sure, here, we're world-class scientists, Nobel Prize-winning physicists. Surely you don't believe in horseshoes." He said, "Oh, no, I don't believe in that, but they say that it still works." So I like the guy. So this critical paradox of the inner teacher and the sifting and winnowing in community is frequently missed or misunderstood, both inside and outside Quakerism. It's easy to mistake our emphasis on the inner teacher as a form of radical individualism. One truth for you, another truth for me, and never mind the difference. But that's a distortion of the tradition, a really grotesque distortion of the tradition, and if it were true, it would make us part of the problem, not part of the solution. I understand you may have your truth and I may have my truth, but I do mind the difference because we live in the same world, and we have to find a way to work out what may have a negative impact on each other. So the Quaker paradox, as I understand it, goes like this. The best teacher we have is that of God within us, an inner teacher that has a voice we must listen for with care. But we have other voices inside us as well. Voices of fear, ego, greed, envy, self-inflation, and self-deprecation. Voices that speak to all of us from time to time. So it is critical to test the truth of what we hear from within, test it in a community that will not give us the answer, but will help us discern the validity of what we're hearing and where it's coming from. It's critical that we listen to the inner teacher and that we test it in a community that doesn't try to give us the answer, but will help us discern, sift and winnow the validity of what we're hearing and where it's coming from. At our best, we practice a rare form of community, and we ought to be talking with people about this. I had never experienced this form of community until I came to Pendle Hill. What do I mean, a rare form of community? It's most clearly seen by comparing it to two false forms of community that dominate our world, not least the world of religion. In one of those forms, the voice of the individual is suppressed and controlled by the group. You can belong to us, but only if you believe, think, and speak the way we do. Dance to our music and follow our choreography. It's a community of conformity. And we can look not only on the right, but on the left to find communities of that sort. In the other form of false community, anyone can say anything he or she wishes, but no one is listening, no one is responding, and no one cares. Does that remind you of anything you've ever, experienced in your life? It happens. It's the degraded form of the open meeting. It's the degraded form of that invitational space where you are free to speak your truth, but who cares? And it does not move towards discernment. It mainly moves toward breeding blowhards. It takes one to know one. Quakers had the genius to invent a third form of community. In it, we can speak in whatever way we feel led and test our leadings in communal settings where others are doing the same. But that testing does not take the form of I'm right and you're wrong arguments. Instead, we speak our own voice into the gathered group. We lay it alongside the voices of others, as if, this is the image that came to me early at Pendle Hill, as if we were laying down threads to be woven on a communal loom into a larger pattern of insight than any one of us could achieve alone. Eventually, what I call a tapestry of truth emerges. A tapestry in which some threads have fallen away, while others have come together with a power and beauty that moves us into action individually and or collectively. This is how I understand the gathered or covered meeting for worship, as well as meeting for worship on the occasion of business, and how blown away I was when I first heard that phrase. You're doing business and you're still worshiping? I grew up in a church where that was inconceivable. Worship was about making nice, and doing business was about fighting. And they were Methodists. I mean, what can I say, It's a gathering in which our souls are joined in communion with the Spirit, the great weaver of life, as well as with each other, ultimately guided by the Spirit if we remain open to it. I don't think we're articulating that very well to the larger world, but I think there are millions who yearn for that form of true community in which they are both free and held. So, a couple of queries. How well do our meetings for worship and business hold the Quaker paradox, helping people winnow and sift whatever they're hearing from within? How well are we helping each other live more deeply into the demands this paradox makes on us, such as learning to listen carefully, to speak honestly, and practice patience and personal vulnerability? There's a lot of personal vulnerability in this form of community, and there's a lot of patience that's required. How often do we fall away from the Quaker paradox toward false community, creating a culture where certain kinds of speech are unwelcome, or where people speak but do not feel heard? For instance, if ours is a predominantly Christ-centered meeting, do Universalist friends feel free to speak? Or is there a silent message that it's uncouth to talk that way here? Or, if ours is a Universalist meeting, do Christ-centered friends feel free to speak? Or, is there a silent message that it's uncouth to speak that way here? I have experienced meetings of both sorts, and I've named the breakdown of the Quaker paradox by giving those examples. And what are we doing to articulate this paradox to the larger public to help outsiders understand the potentials of this rare form of community? It's a huge gift. It changed my life. I want more people not only to know about it, but to experience it. The fourth element of my transformation had to do with community as a lived experience of everyday life. During my decade plus at Pendle Hill, 70 people lived in closer proximity than anything I had experienced outside of my own family. We worshiped together, ate meals together, studied, did physical work, made decisions together, and in ways, large and small, did our best to look after each other. It was also a community of radical economic equality. While I was there in that era, everyone made the same base salary, regardless of title, job description, or credentials. I could give a whole talk on the impact that had on my life. It was huge. It was a leveling. It was a scraping away of a sense of entitlement. I don't think a person who looks like me can ever totally lose in this society that's made for people who look like me, can totally lose a sense of entitlement. But that way of living at Pendle Hill scraped away at it and ground away at it, and the grinding continues to this day. Living that way for 11 years gave me gifts too numerous to mention or to count, so I'll just name a couple of them. The first one may surprise you if you're imagining that I'm now going to talk about the peaceable kingdom. The gift was actually experiencing tension and conflict and learning how to make creative use of them, which I think is one of the great gifts of life in community. When 70 people live in close proximity, it's inevitable that you sometimes end up in close combat with one or more of them. Unquakerly, I know, but it happens. As it says in the scripture, wherever 2 or 3 are gathered, there sooner or later will be a squabble. There's actually a chapter in the Apocrypha where they talk about how they argued over who was going to pay the bill at the Last Supper. But that's a different topic. When that experience of tension and conflict is what led to my definition of community, which I came up with at the end of my first year at Pendle Hill. Quote, community is that place where the person you least want to live with always lives. At the end of my second year, some of you have obviously been there, and I'd love, and it's probably the same person. I don't know. We can compare lists later. At the end of my second year, I came up with Palmer's addendum to Palmer's definition, which goes like this. When that person moves away, someone else arises immediately to take his or her place. It always happens. I'm pretty convinced that unless I really take charge of this, what's going to be engraved on my tombstone is Parker is now living with the person he least wants to live with. God moves in mysterious ways and sometimes in ways that make me extremely unhappy. Behind those half jesting, maybe one-quarter jesting definitions are two things I learned from life together. First, in the intimacy of a close-knit community, there is always someone on whom you can project problems and issues that in fact reside within you. I give you my own version of Birdman, right? Those were my problems, not his. So when you meet the person you least want to live with, you are meeting yourself in the mirror, which gives you a great opportunity for self-knowledge, however painful, and for forgiveness of the other and of yourself. In some ways, this is the insight at the heart of nonviolence, is it not? Because understanding projection and how projection works keeps us from making enemies everywhere we go. As Pogo famously said, we have met the enemy and it is us. The second thing I learned from this kind of close combat is that conflict does not signal the end of community. On the contrary, conflict is the doorway into deeper community. And I think as a peace-loving people, we need to embrace that, understand it, and live into it. Sometimes people can work through it by themselves. Sometimes they require third-party mediation. Sometimes the resolution comes in ways that can only be called grace. Whatever it takes, community is deepened when we learn to live into the definition of community offered by a great man named Jean Vanier, who founded the L'Arche communities around the world, where people with developmental disabilities live side by side in partnership with those who don't have those particular disabilities. Jean Vanier said, and he's a saint, community is a continual act of forgiveness. And I love that definition a lot. As a faith community that has always been reluctant to engage in verbal proselytizing, a reluctance I'm inviting us to rethink with some of this language that I think others can understand. I think we Quakers should never forget what Tertullian, a church historian of the 2nd century, said about what animated the growth of the early church. He said that strangers looked in on those early churches and said, "See how they love one another. See how they love one another." It wasn't about theology. It wasn't about choreographed moves. It wasn't about the elegance of the building. In an era when just being a stranger made you eligible to be killed, strangers looked in on this group of strangers and said, "See how they love one another." Love with the power to draw others in is the kind of love we learn only by going through hard times together. So conflict is not the end of community. It's the doorway into deeper and transformative forms of community. So, here are a couple of queries that come to me as I look back on this formative element, next to last element of my experience at Pendle Hill. Beyond gathering for worship and business, what other forms of life together are available to our members and attenders? The wider the variety of forms, from potluck suppers to work days to shared social action, the deeper the experience of lived community. Second query, how open and honest are we about the tensions and conflicts that lie just beneath the surface whenever 2 or 3 are gathered? Or do we regard tension and conflict as so unquakerly that we try to wish it away by not naming it and claiming it, doing what we in the Midwest call simply making nice on each other, making nice? And a third query, how well do we teach the principle that conflict is not the end but the beginning of true community, and how well do we support people who are trying to bring that principle into practice? Fifth and final element of my transformation was the way people at Pendle Hill did their best to walk the talk when it came to the Quaker social testimonies. As some of you may remember, Howard Brinton named those testimonies early in Pendle Hill's history, the testimonies that he wanted Pendle Hill to live into, as simplicity, peace, integrity, community, and equality. Pendle Hill was founded as a living laboratory of these testimonies, and though it did not achieve perfect embodiment, which is always beyond our reach, wholeness is not about perfection, It's about embracing our brokenness as an integral part of life. Pendle Hill lived into these human possibilities as well as any community I know, and better than most. At the same time, we had the predictable differences, tensions, and conflicts over what the testimonies are meant to look like in practice. And as I've already said, I learned much from the openness with which we held those differences. For example, we struggled with the absence of certain forms of diversity, as I know the Quaker community continues to do today, without which the equality testimony does not get fully or deeply tested. At Pendle Hill, we had diversity in age, in vocation, in sexual orientation, theological convictions, all important. But when it came to race and social class, we mostly looked like peas in a pod. But we lived into the integrity testimony by having the courage to discuss this issue openly and regularly, rather than ignoring it and pretending that all was well. I think I had my first immersion into the hard awareness of white privilege during those discussions at Pendle Hill. It was something I hadn't learned during 5 years as a community organizer working on issues of race in Washington, D.C. It took this community to take me there, and I'm still on that journey. Furthermore, living into the equality testimony does not begin with the external markers of diversity. I've lost count of the number of times I've been called by a pastor to help his or her, this is how they always say it, homogeneous white congregation become more diverse. I always answer, no, I won't do that. When they ask me why, I explain, there's no such thing as a homogeneous white congregation. There's only a bunch of white people pretending they have no differences among them for fear that bringing them to the surface would blow the whole thing up. So if you can't deal with your own invisible internal differences, why on earth would someone with a visible difference want to join you? If you're willing to fess up to that, I'm willing to work with you, but otherwise, no deal. What I especially treasure about this part of my Pendle Hill experience is the way we held our differences over the testimonies and over larger questions of theology without engaging in political correctness or verbal pyrotechnics. Here's a story that will illustrate what I mean. It involves a man dear to my heart that some of you will know, Robin Harper, who was head of maintenance at Pendle Hill while I was there. Robin is well known among friends as a conscientious war tax resistor. This not only meant the possibility of prosecution and imprisonment, although I think every judge he ever appeared before was so taken with his absolute integrity that they didn't want to pursue legal action. But war tax resistance also made heavy demands on Robin's life. He had to be employed by people who would agree not to withhold any taxes, shrinking his job opportunities dramatically, and he could not own any real property that could be seized and turned into cash by the IRS. I shared Robin's abhorrence of war as a person in his mid-30s, but I could not imagine with a family taking the risks and making the sacrifices that Robin did. I was at that stage of moral development that some of you may recognize. I had very high ethical aspirations and equally high levels of guilt about the way I continually fell short. It's a formula for a good life, I tell you. Aim high, hit low, and feel lousy about yourself the whole time. So one day, and please note the number of times in these stories I, with something that really felt upstream to Quakerism to me, also felt able to go to the elders who carried safe space within themselves. One day I went to Robin, told him of my admiration and my dilemma. I believe what you believe, I said, and I want to put my beliefs into action, but I just cannot bring myself to do what you do. Robin responded plainly, simply, and with great compassion. Keep holding the belief, he said, and follow wherever it may lead you. As time goes on, you will find your own way of resisting violence and promoting peace. That's Quakerism at its best. That's community at its best. That's teaching at its best. That's friendship at its best. I know we have differences among us on theology and ethics, but we must hold them in ways that invite us to move forward together, not drive us apart. I hope there's no Quaker anywhere who believes that our declining membership is due to the fact that we have not argued enough about our diverse theological convictions, trying to stake a claim of theological purity around which others will rally. Believe me, the people who are leaving organized religion are doing so partly because of all the silly theological food fights about that which lies beyond all naming, fights that seem to leave people with little energy to demonstrate what their faith looks like when it is lived. Here are some questions that come to me as I look back on this final formative element of my life at Pendle Hill. Do we regularly lift up the Quaker social testimonies and talk about the ways the Quaker community has lived into them historically? Do we discuss current affairs in the context of our social testimonies and wait upon the Spirit for guidance around the ancient question, how then shall we live? Now, I said at the outset that without the Quaker tradition, neither my life nor my work would have taken the form that it has, a form to which I've felt led, a form that at age 76 brings me continuing struggle but deep satisfaction, a sense of being broken whole. In many ways, the work I've done is a direct extension of my decade plus at Pendle Hill and the impact of Quaker faith and practice on my life. I'm referring not only to my writing, but to a project I began back in the 90s, which, with the help of many people, some of them here tonight, became a nonprofit organization now called the Center for Courage and Renewal. Thanks to its very able leadership, leaders younger and smarter than I, the Center's work has had quite a reach. We now have 240 facilitators around the U.S., as well as in Canada, England, Australia, and South Korea. We offer various long-term retreat series for a wide variety of people, including K-12 teachers and school leaders, faculty and administrators in higher education, physicians and other healthcare professionals, clergy, philanthropists, nonprofit leaders, attorneys, judges, and others. More recently, we've been developing programs for citizens who want to help renew American democracy. Over the past dozen years, some 80,000 people have been directly involved in our programs, and many, many times more than that have been touched by what those people brought back to their classrooms and their medical practice and their courtrooms and so on. When people ask me for the elevator speech about what we do, I say I never take the elevator, I take the stairs. So, but if they insist, I say we help people by creating safe spaces rejoin soul and role. And that, I would argue, is another pressing need in our world. How do we help people in these critical positions bring more of their identity and integrity into the workplace? In our programs, a cohort of 20 to 25 participants travel together through a series of facilitated 3-day retreats across a period of 12, 18, or 24 months 4 retreats, 5 retreats, 8 retreats. This gives us time to have more than a mountaintop weekend experience and then find ourselves in the valley of the shadow of death by Monday afternoon. It gives us time to go deeply inward in the context of a community shaped by what I've called the Quaker paradox, a community of solitudes, a way of being alone together. Our goal in these retreats is, again, to create safe space. We call it a circle of trust for people to listen to their inner teacher, to rejoin soul and role. When people who are familiar with Pendle Hill ask me to describe my work, I say very simply, the Center for Courage and Renewal is Pendle Hill on the road. And I'm astonished by the fact that we've touched the lives of 80,000 people in positions of great influence in the lives of young people, old people, well people, dying people, people doing heavy lifting, the kind we all want to support. The attractiveness of our programs, we don't wave the Quaker flag over them, but I've never made any secret of the fact that I'm writing from a Quaker standpoint. The attractiveness of our programs rooted in Quaker faith and practice has persuaded me that Quakerism still speaks powerfully to people's condition. In closing, there's one feature of our programs and of life at Pendle Hill that I want to lift up as a transformational element. It's an element in which the Quaker community is not lacking. We saw that. We've seen that throughout this meeting. We certainly saw it last night. But maybe one we need to cultivate more consciously as a people too often seen as overly somber and sober, the way George Bernard Shaw apparently saw the good people of Bestbrook in Northern Ireland. I'm talking about joy and laughter. I can't imagine being on a spiritual journey without laughing at myself and at the way we get our wires crossed in life. And I can't imagine taking that journey without people who can laugh together. Laughter is the practice that allows angels to fly, because, as Chesterton said, they take themselves lightly. Laughter is the leaven of life, the corrective to that spiritual gravitas that makes a bread of life so heavy it gives us a bellyache. Without laughter, we so easily get ourselves into deep oatmeal. Joseph Campbell said something that I regard as very wise. People say that what we're all seeking is a meaning for life. I don't think that at bottom that's what we're really seeking. I think that what we're seeking, he said, is an experience of being alive, so that our life experiences on the purely physical plane will have resonance with our innermost being and reality, so that we actually feel the rapture of being alive. That's what it's all about, Campbell said. So one final query. Are we sharing with people the joy and vitality of a life lived in vulnerable listening to each other and the Spirit? The joy and vitality of a life lived in honest speaking about our fears, our hopes, our faith. The joy and vitality of finding ourselves at home in our own skin and at home on the face of this richly diverse earth. The joy and vitality of learning to be in deep service to the world's deepest needs as a people who have been broken whole. Amen.